The familiar, loopy script of my sister's handwriting caught my eye immediately. The envelope was tucked between the stiff, black pages of my old photo album. I was up in the attic, a task I'd been putting off for years, and the dust was making my arthritis throb something fierce. That album was from my first marriage, a whole lifetime ago it seemed now. Carefully, I pulled the yellowed letter free. The date at the top just stopped my breath. It was written 2 days after I was discharged from the hospital, feeling so empty-armed and shattered I could barely function. They told me my son was stillborn. I read the first line, and I swear the floor tilted right under my feet. Dearest Helen, by the time you read this, your healthy baby boy will have a new mother. I couldn't let you have everything while I had nothing. The words swam and blurred before my eyes. A cold, sharp clarity cut right through 60 years of quiet grief. It was Martha, my own sister, the one who had held my hand in that stark hospital room and wept with me, the one who had brought me casseroles for weeks afterward, saying time would heal the wound. All of it, a performance. The attic air grew thick and close. Down below, through the small window, I could hear my Frank puttering in his vegetable garden, whistling a tune, completely oblivious. My heart hammered a painful, familiar rhythm against my ribs, the same feeling I got every Mother's Day. I had to sit down on an old leather trunk we'd never gotten rid of. I smoothed the brittle paper on my knee, my fingers trembling badly. I made myself read it again, each word landing like a branding iron on my soul. She wrote of her jealousy over my perfect marriage to my first husband, contrasting it with her own failed engagement. She saw her chance in my sedation and confusion after the difficult birth. She made the call to an agency. She was the one who handed my living son over. I thought of a lifetime of Mother's Days spent quietly mourning a ghost. A lifetime of looking at my grandchildren, Michael and Sophie, and wondering what traits their uncle might have had. All of it stolen. Not by cruel fate, but by the curve of Martha's thin, envious smile. A quiet fire ignited deep in my chest, burning away the initial shock. This wasn't just a family secret. It felt like a crime against my very soul. I carefully, precisely, folded the letter back into its envelope. My hands were steady now, a strange calm settling over me. I knew what I had to do first. I had to find out if that adoption agency still existed, or what records might be left. And I had to do it all before Martha, who was coming over for our regular bridge game next Tuesday, could sense any change in me. I tucked the envelope deep into the pocket of my sensible house dress. I would smile. I would serve her Earl Grey and the lemon biscuits she likes, and I would remember every single devastating word she had written. The phone felt heavy as a brick in my hand. I stood in the quiet hallway, listening to the empty house, and dialed the number for the county records office. My finger was stiff on the old rotary dial. Frank was out, safely at his weekly bowling league with the boys. The silence around me felt thick, like the house was holding its breath right along with me. After a few rings, a clerk answered, her voice flat and bored. I cleared my throat, trying to sound firmer than I felt. I asked about adoption records from that specific year and that hospital. My own voice came out sounding frail and old to my ears, and I hated it. I tried to put on a more official tone and gave the date again. There was a long pause. I could hear the faint clack of a keyboard on the other end of the line. Then her voice returned, no more interested than before. She said the records from that entire period were sealed by a specific court order. My heart sank. She read the name who filed it. Martha Jenkins, my sister's maiden name. The reason cited was potential familial disruption. So she had tied it all up legally, decades ago, Just knowing she had gone to that trouble, that she had thought so far ahead, made me feel more alone than ever. She had built this perfect bureaucratic wall, and it felt impossible to climb. The clerk's only suggestion was to get a lawyer. I thanked her, my voice small, and hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a dull roar. A lawyer meant money we hadn't planned on spending. It meant time, and worse, it meant explanations to Frank. He is a good man, but he likes a quiet life. This would shake our quiet. I walked slowly into the living room and looked at the framed photos on the sideboard. There was our daughter Emily, smiling with her 2 children at the beach last summer. They all know the story of the baby we lost. They have grieved that vague shadow with me over the years. What would this hard, specific truth do to them? Would it feel like a betrayal, all these years of not knowing? The worry sat in my stomach like a cold stone. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, a sharp sound that made me jump. I moved to the front window and peered through the lace curtain. Martha's blue sedan was parked in my driveway. It wasn't Tuesday. We had our standing Tuesday coffee date. She never, ever visited unannounced. My pulse began to skitter like a frightened bird. Had she somehow sensed my discovery? Was that even possible? I quickly shoved the letter from yesterday deeper into my apron pocket. I took a breath, pasted on my best polite smile, and opened the door. She stood there, perfectly composed, holding a white bakery box. "Betty, I was just driving back from the plaza and thought you might like some of that cheesecake you enjoy," she trilled, her voice too bright. Her eyes, however, didn't meet mine for long. They darted past my shoulder, scanning the hall table, glancing into the living room. She wasn't here for cake. She was checking on her secret, making sure her walls were still standing. I took the heavy box, my smile never wavering. "How thoughtful, Martha. Do come in for a minute." I would remember this too, every sweet, false note. I lay awake for a long time, waiting until Frank was snoring softly beside me. In the dark stillness of our bedroom, I replayed every moment of Martha's visit, her probing questions about how I'd been spending my time, her too bright smile and feigned interest in my attic cleaning project. She was nervous, I could tell. Good. Let her be. My initial thought of a lawyer now seemed too loud, too slow for what I needed. Legal records might be sealed, but people's memories aren't. There had to be someone who remembered. A nurse, a social worker, an orderly from that small old hospital. The thought of my son, a face I'd never seen, pushed me forward through the dread. It was a physical ache, older than the one in my joints. The next morning, over toast and tea, I told Frank I was meeting an old friend from my book club for a long lunch. He just nodded, utterly absorbed in his newspaper and the sports scores. The bus ride across town was a trial. My rheumatism has been fierce lately, and every jolt and bump sent a sharp shock through my hips and knees. I gripped the seat handle, watching my familiar neighborhood give way to parts of the city I seldom visit anymore. The old hospital complex had been swallowed by a sprawling modern medical center, all gleaming glass and steel. But the original red brick administration building still stood off to the side, looking shabby and forgotten, like an old dollhouse beside a skyscraper. It took me a good 5 minutes to walk from the bus stop to the side door marked Archives and Records. A young man with large headphones was typing behind the counter. He looked up, annoyance flashing across his face at the interruption. I summoned my calmest, most grandmotherly voice and explained I was hoping to find some information about a birth from many, many years ago. I gave him the date, my heart thumping. He didn't even bother checking a computer. He just shook his head. "Anything from that far back would be on microfiche," he said, "and that system's been down for weeks. They keep saying they'll migrate the data. Sorry. He didn't sound sorry. It felt like another solid wall, built by Martha's influence. A ghost in the machinery, blocking me at every turn. Defeated, I turned to hobble back out into the hallway. That's when I saw it. On a cluttered cork bulletin board behind his desk, nearly hidden by flyers for flu shots and parking permits, a faded colour photograph from a staff retirement party decades ago. A group of nurses in those old-fashioned white caps stood smiling, my eyes locked on one face, round and kind, with a distinctive mole just above her lip. Agnes, my night nurse. Dear Agnes, who had held my hand so tightly when they told me. She had cried real, warm tears that dripped onto our clasped hands, or so I had believed all these years. Looking at her smiling face in that old photo, a new thought whispered, maybe she knew more. The name on her tag was faint but readable, Agnes Miller. The young man was already putting his headphones back on. I didn't dare ask him anything. I just committed the name to memory, repeating it silently. Agnes Miller. A name, after all this time, is a thread. And I have learned you can unravel a great deal by pulling on a single thread. Finding Agnes Miller took 3 full days and finally required the help of my granddaughter, Sophie. She's Emily's teenage girl, sharp as a tack with that computer of hers. When I asked for help with a genealogy project, she called it an internet deep dive. I felt a real pang of guilt, involving a grandchild in my little deceit, even so indirectly. But it worked. Sophie found an address in a retirement community called Oak Haven Estates, about 40 minutes' drive from my house. I now had a real place to go, a living person to see. I drove there on a bright Thursday morning, my knuckles white on the steering wheel the whole way. Oak Haven was a pleasant place with neatly manicured lawns and wide, quiet sidewalks. The kind of spot my friends and I sometimes talk about for someday. My heart was thumping as I found Building 1 and Apartment 114. I knocked, and the door opened slowly. Agnes Miller stood there, smaller and frailer than I remembered, using a walker. But the kind eyes and the distinct mole on her cheek were just the same. I said my name. Recognition. Then a profound sadness washed over her face. She didn't ask why I was there. She just sighed deeply and said, I wondered if you'd ever come. Please, come in. Her tidy living room smelled of lemons and old books. She offered me tea, and this time I accepted, needing something to hold. I sat on the edge of a floral-patterned sofa. You knew, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded, looking down at her own gnarled hands resting in her lap. I wasn't on duty that day when it happened, but I came on for the next shift. Your sister was there, in the hallway, speaking with the head social worker, Eleanor Graves. She was very persuasive. She said it was for the best, that you were too unstable to care for a child. She made it sound so final, so decided. Hearing it confirmed by someone who was there, by a witness, was entirely different from just reading the cold words in a file. The air left my lungs. Why didn't you ever tell me? I managed to ask. Agnes looked at me, her eyes gleaming with unshed tears. She threatened me, said she'd have me fired for negligence if I spoke a word to anyone. I was a single mother back then. I needed that job desperately. I've carried that shame with me for 60 years. She took a shaky breath. She described Eleanor Graves as a stern, unyielding woman who firmly believed in clean breaks. Then Agnes gave me a crucial piece of information. She believed Miss Graves might have kept private notes, separate from the official file. She passed away years ago, but her daughter still lived locally. Agnes slowly wrote down the name and last known address on a slip of lined paper. My hand trembled as I took it from her. It was another thread to pull, thinner and more fragile than the last. But it was something. It was a lead my sister Martha didn't know I had. Eleanor Graves's daughter lived in a tidy bungalow not far from my own neighborhood. Her name was Carol, a stern-looking woman in her 60s who answered the door with clear suspicion. I stood on her porch, feeling exposed. I told her I was seeking information about my son's adoption, that her mother might have been involved. Carol's face tightened. My mother's professional files were destroyed upon her retirement. Policy. It was a rehearsed line. The weight of Martha's old secrecy was now embodied in this guarded daughter. I needed to get past that door, in every sense. I had to stand there, my dignity set aside, and ask. "I'm not looking for trouble," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I'm an old woman trying to find a piece of my heart before it's too late." I saw a flicker in her eyes, not sympathy, but something else. Recognition. "Wait here," she said abruptly and closed the door. I stood on the mat, the spring sun feeling cold. Minutes ticked by. Was she calling the police? Calling Martha? My heart thudded. Finally, the door opened again. She held a small, nondescript cardboard box. "These weren't official files," she said stiffly. "These were her personal journals. I haven't had the heart to read them all. I don't want to know what's in there. Take it, and don't come back." She thrust the box into my arms and closed the door with a firm click. The weight of it surprised me. I carried it back to my car like a treasure, my arms aching. I didn't drive home. I drove to the quiet public library, to a corner table where no one knew me. My hands trembled as I opened the box. Inside were a dozen leather-bound notebooks, dated by year. I found the one from that fateful year. The pages were filled with tight, efficient script. I skimmed, my eyes searching for my name, for Martha's, for the hospital. And then I found it. A single entry, dated the day after I left the hospital. It was not just a note. It was a transaction. Private adoption facilitated for infant male Jenkins, arranged by maternal aunt M. Jenkins. Receipt of a $5,000 facilitation fee, acknowledged. Case closed. Martha didn't just give my son away. She sold him. The grief that had defined my life curdled into something dark and furious. I closed the journal. The quiet of the library pressed in on me. This was no longer about finding a child. It was about confronting a monster I had called my sister. And I knew, with cold certainty, that the law might not care about 60-year-old sins. I needed a different kind of justice. I needed her to feel the hollow ache she had given me. I needed to take from her what she valued most. I thought of her perfect house, her carefully curated reputation as the generous, capable sister. I smiled. I knew where to start. I sat in my parked car outside the library for a long time, the journal entry burning in my mind. $5,000. In those days, that was a down payment on a nice house. Martha had used my son as currency. I started the engine, a new plan forming with cold clarity. I would not go to the police with this old journal. The statute of limitations on such a shady transaction had surely expired. I would fight back using Martha's own methods, secrecy, patience, and a deep knowledge of what she loved. I drove straight to my lawyer's office, a small, quiet practice run by a man named Robert Hargrove, who had handled Frank's and my wills years ago. I didn't mention the adoption. I presented a different, equally true problem. "Robert," I said, settling into the chair opposite his orderly desk. "I've become concerned. My sister, Martha, has been showing an unusual interest in my financial affairs lately. asking pointed questions about my will, about the house's equity. It's making me uncomfortable. I saw the professional concern flicker in his eyes. Elders being pressured by family is, sadly, a common tale. I leaned forward. I want to review everything. I want to make absolutely certain that my assets, this house, our savings, go directly to Frank and then to Emily and the children, with no intermediaries. He nodded, understanding completely. We scheduled a proper appointment for the following week to redraft and reaffirm every document. My next stop was the bank. I asked to speak with the manager privately. In a small, windowless office, I explained that I wished to revoke any and all old powers of attorney on file, save for the one naming my husband. I also requested that a note be placed on our joint accounts. No large withdrawals or changes were to be authorized without both Frank and me present in person, with ID. The manager, a woman named Linda, around my daughter's age, was gracious and efficient. "It's a smart precaution, Mrs. Wilkins," she said. "We see all sorts of things." As I signed the forms, I felt a layer of armor clicking into place. Martha's access, any old back door she might have thought she had, was now welded shut. That evening, I called my daughter, Emily. I kept my voice light. "Sweetheart, your father and I are just doing some boring old estate planning tidy up. Mr. Hargrove might reach out to you just to confirm some beneficiary details for the grandchildren's trusts, that's all." She barely registered it, busy with her own life, and just said, "Okay, Mom. Whatever you need?" Good. I was laying the groundwork, and no one, not even my dear Frank, knew the real fight I was preparing for. I was securing my home before the attack even began. I knew, deep in my bones, that when Martha realized her own perfect life was under threat, she would come for mine. I needed to be ready. The official meeting with Robert Hargrove was set for Tuesday at 10 a.m. That was also, by long-standing tradition, the day Martha came for bridge and lunch at 1 p.m. The timing felt like a sign. I dressed carefully in a nice skirt and blouse, the picture of a sensible grandmother tending to her affairs. Frank kissed my cheek before leaving for the garden centre, none the wiser. Robert was thorough. We went over the will line by line, ensuring Martha was not mentioned as a beneficiary, an executor, or even a backup guardian. We notarized new durable powers of attorney for healthcare and finances, naming Emily as successor after Frank. Each signature was a silent victory. I arrived home just after noon. I had exactly 45 minutes to transform from a strategic client back into a doting sister. I put the kettle on and arranged the lemon biscuits on her favorite plate. At exactly 1 o'clock, her car pulled in. She swept in, her perfume too strong as usual, and immediately her eyes began their inventory of my home. "You look tired, Betty," she declared, peering at me. "All this running around you've been doing lately, it's not good for you." The comment was a probe, disguised as concern. I just smiled and handed her a teacup. "Just the usual errands, Martha. You know how it is." We sat in the sunroom. She dominated the conversation, as always, talking about her garden club's upcoming tour, a subtle boast about her prize roses. I nodded and made the right noises, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about the $5,000. What had she bought with it? I remembered that shortly after my loss, she had suddenly taken a trip to Europe, a solo vacation she said was to mend her broken heart. We had all thought it was a strange extravagance for a secretary. Now I knew how she had afforded it. Then, as she reached for a second biscuit, she dropped her bomb. "I've been thinking, Betty. This house is really too much for you and Frank. The stairs alone." I've been looking at that lovely new assisted living community over on Maple Ridge. They have a waiting list, you know. I could put in a good word for you." The air left the room. She wasn't just stealing my past. She was trying to orchestrate my future, to pack me away neatly. I kept my smile plastered on, but my hand tightened around my saucer. "How thoughtful," I said, my voice even. "But we're quite happy here." Her smile was cold and did not touch her eyes. She was testing my defenses. I realized then that her campaign was already underway. My legal paperwork was my fortress. But I needed to attack. I needed to target the very thing she was most proud of. After Martha left, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather settling deep in my bones. Her mentioning that retirement community felt like a declaration of war between sisters. She was positioning herself as the concerned, capable one, clearly laying the groundwork to have me deemed unable to manage my own affairs. I knew I had to move faster with my quiet investigation. My target became perfectly clear: her own house. That charming, historic Cape Cod she was forever so proud of, the one she'd bought shortly after her big European trip. I needed to know if my dear late husband's money, taken from our son's fund, was buried in its very foundation. I enlisted my granddaughter Sophie again, this time with a more specific request. "Grandma's doing some family history research," I told her over the phone, keeping my voice light. "Can you find out how to get old property records? Like, who owned Aunt Martha's house before she bought it, and what the official sale price was?" Sophie, ever thrilled to play detective for me, had the information in just an hour. "The local records were all digitized," she said. Martha had purchased the house in a private sale from an elderly couple named the Higgins. The recorded sale price was a mere $18,500. I thanked my clever granddaughter profusely and hung up, my mind whirring. That number meant little on its own. I needed the context of the time. I called my old friend Robert Hargrove back, the retired banker. This time I posed a hypothetical. "Robert, if a single secretary wanted to buy an $18,500 home back in 1964, what would a typical down payment have been?" He pondered for a moment. "Back then? Goodness, perhaps 10 to 20%, so $1,850 to $3,700. I thanked him kindly. According to the bank records from my father's journal, Martha's down payment had been a clean $5,000, far more than what was typical. It was the exact sum I believed she'd taken. The evidence was still circumstantial, but to my heart, it drew a direct line from my arms, cradling my infant son, right to her prized front door. I couldn't prove it in a court of law, and I didn't need to. I needed her to know that I knew. I needed to tarnish the thing she loved most. An idea began to form, involving the annual neighborhood garden club tour she was always boasting about. It was the highlight of her social calendar, where she showed off her perfect home and impeccable gardens to all her friends. The tour was in just 2 weeks. I looked at my father's worn journal on my desk, then at the property records Sophie had printed for me. A quiet, devastating plan settled in my mind. I would not confront her privately. No, I would let her have her moment in the sun, surrounded by her admirers. And then I would ensure everyone saw the rot at the center of her perfect world. With a calm I didn't fully feel, I called the number on the garden tour flyer she'd left on my table. "I'd like to volunteer to help at my sister Martha's home on the day of the tour," I said sweetly to the coordinator. "I know the property and its history so very well." They were absolutely delighted to have me. The 2 weeks before the garden tour crawled by, each day feeling longer than the last. I played my part perfectly, just as I'd planned. I invited Martha over for coffee again, sitting patiently in my own kitchen while she laid out her endless, meticulous plans for the big day. To secure my position, I offered to handle the refreshment table inside her dining room. She accepted with a smug little smile, clearly believing I was finally falling in line and acknowledging her role as the neighborhood's leading hostess. My Frank noticed I was a bit preoccupied, but he just patted my hand and chalked it up to what he calls women's club nonsense. I was happy to let him think exactly that. The morning of the tour dawned clear and bright, a perfect June day. Martha's house was already a hive of activity when I arrived early, wearing my best linen dress and my calmest smile. Vases of her prize roses sat on every surface. I set about arranging the lemonade pitcher and plates of delicate cookies on her polished mahogany dining table, the one she's so proud of. From this post, I had a perfect view of the front door, the hallway, and most importantly, the living room fireplace mantel, where she had displayed her most cherished family photographs. Soon, visitors began to stream in, clusters of well-dressed women from the garden club and beyond, all murmuring polite praises. Martha was in her absolute element, leading guided tours of her perennial borders outside. When a group came inside to escape the growing heat, I played the part of the gracious sister, offering them refreshments with a smile. As the dining room filled, I saw my moment. I picked up a tray of empty cups and carried it into the living room, where another small group was admiring Martha's antique furniture. I positioned myself near Helen Briggs, a kind woman I know from my own church. She was looking at the photos on the mantel. "Such a lovely home," Helen said to me quietly. "Martha has such wonderful taste." I nodded, making sure my voice was just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Yes, she's always had an eye for quality. It's truly remarkable what she was able to accomplish, especially so soon after that terribly difficult time when my first baby, little James, died." I let a faint old sorrow soften my words. Helen turned to me, her face instantly full of sympathy. I continued, gazing at a photo of a young Martha standing proudly before this very house. She bought this place not long after that loss. It was to be her fresh start. I was so lost in my own grief, but she found a way to move forward. She even managed a trip to Europe that following summer. I let the implication hang in the quiet air. A certain financial resilience following a shared family tragedy. I saw the flicker of understanding in Helen's eyes, a subtle recalculation, a seed of quiet question, now planted in the most fertile social soil imaginable. I excused myself then, saying I needed to fetch more napkins. As I walked away, the gentle murmur of conversation behind me seemed to carry a new, more thoughtful tone. The garden tour ended, and Martha was flushed with triumph. She barely thanked me for my help, too busy accepting final compliments. I left feeling a grim satisfaction. The first stone had been cast. It would take time for whispers to grow, but I had planted the doubt. Now, I needed something more tangible. I needed to look into the eyes of the woman who facilitated the sale. Eleanor Graves was dead, but the journal mentioned a facilitation fee. That suggested a business. I spent the next days at the library again, searching old business directories on microfilm. Finally, I found it. Graves Adoption Services. Listed for only 3 years, including the year my son was born. The address was a P.O. box, a dead end. But the name Graves stuck with me. Carol, the stern daughter, had given me the journals to be rid of them. But what if Eleanor had kept more than journals? I drove back to Carol's bungalow. This time, I didn't ring the bell. I watched from my car for an hour until I saw her leave, walking a small, irritable-looking dog. I timed it. She was gone for 20 minutes. It was now or never. I am not a criminal, but desperation makes you bold. I walked quickly to her side gate, which was unlocked, and into the backyard. My heart hammered against my ribs. There, against the back fence, was a small, dilapidated garden shed. The padlock was rusty, but cheap. I looked around, found a loose brick in a flower bed, and with 2 hard strikes, the lock snapped. The door creaked open. Inside was typical garden clutter, but in the corner was a water-stained cardboard file box. I dragged it into the light. The label, faded but clear, read, "Business Receipts." My hands were filthy and shaking as I lifted the lid. Inside were carbon copy receipt books, bound with rubber bands. I found the year. I flipped through the thin, crispy pages. And there it was. A receipt, numbered, made out to M. Jenkins for consultation and facilitation services in the amount of $5,000. It was signed by Eleanor Graves. And in the memo line, in faint pencil, was a single word: Jenkins, infant. I had it. The concrete proof. Not just a journal entry, but a business record. I didn't take it. That would be theft. Instead, I took out my phone, a modern tool Frank had insisted I carry. My hands trembled as I opened the camera app. I took multiple pictures of the receipt, the box, the shed interior, ensuring every word was clear. The flash illuminated the dust in the air. I heard a car door slam out front. Carol was back. I carefully replaced everything exactly as it was, slipped out of the yard, and hurried to my car parked around the corner. I had the evidence. Now I had to decide what to do with a proof of a crime that everyone but me would consider ancient history. I sat in my car around the corner from Carol's house, my phone heavy in my hand. The photos were clear. I had the proof. But what good was proof of a 60-year-old crime that no court would care about? My victory felt hollow and sharp. I didn't want a courtroom. I wanted Martha's soul. I needed her to acknowledge what she'd done, to feel the weight of it. I drove home on autopilot, the familiar streets blurring. When I walked in, Frank was in the kitchen, making his famous chili. "You look pale, Betty," he said, his brow furrowed with real concern. The warmth of the house, the smell of cumin and tomatoes, felt like a separate world from the cold shed and its secret. I forced a smile. "Just a long day of errands, dear. Tired." He accepted that, humming as he stirred. The normalcy of it was a kind of agony. I retreated to the small den we called the reading room and closed the door. I printed the photos of the receipt on plain paper. The numbers, the signatures, looked so ordinary, so bureaucratic. This slip of paper was the price tag on my son. I studied every detail. Then I saw something I'd missed in the shed. At the very bottom of the receipt, in tiny typed letters, was a file number, GA642, a Graves adoption case number. My mind raced. If there was a case number, there might be a corresponding file elsewhere. Not with Carol, who had the journals, but perhaps somewhere else. A record of where my son went. The adoption was private, shady, but maybe not entirely off the books. This was the thread I hadn't dared hope for. The receipt wasn't just a weapon against Martha. It was a potential map. But following it meant more digging, more risk of alerting someone. I felt Martha's pressure constantly, a silent hum. Her suggestion about assisted living hung in the air between us, a threat she thought was subtle. That evening, as Frank dozed in front of the television, I made a decision. I couldn't do this alone anymore. I needed professional help, but not a lawyer who would focus on the unprosecutable crime. I needed a discreet private investigator, one who specialized in adoptions from that era. It would cost money from our savings, money I would have to explain to Frank. It was a price I was willing to pay, but the conversation loomed like a storm cloud. I found a name online, Martin Lowe, located in the city. His website mentioned sensitive familial reunifications. I bookmarked the page. The first step was calling him tomorrow. The second, harder step was telling my husband a part of the truth. I looked at Frank's peaceful, sleeping face. I would have to break his heart to possibly mend my own. The phone call to Martin Lowe was brief, and I knew from the long-distance clicks it was expensive. My hands were trembling as I held the receiver. I explained the situation in the vaguest terms I could manage. A private adoption from the 1960s, a case number, a crumbling receipt. His voice was so calm and professional, it immediately made me feel a bit foolish. "That's a start," he said after a moment. "The original agency is defunct, but these old case numbers sometimes cross-reference with intermediary attorneys or notaries. It's a long shot, but I've seen longer ones pay off." Then he quoted his retainer fee. The sum made me wince right there in my quiet kitchen. I thought of my son David, and it felt like I was draining money from his family's future. A future that was altered 60 years ago without my knowing. But I agreed, reading my credit card number slowly over the secure line he provided. Hanging up, I felt a strange mix of things, lighter for having taken a step, and infinitely more burdened by the cost and the hope. Telling Frank was the next mountain to climb. I waited for a calm moment after our Thursday meatloaf dinner, when we were settled on the porch swing, watching the fireflies blink over the lawn. I took his work-roughened hand in mine. "Frank," I began, my voice unsteady. "I need to tell you something. I found a box in the attic. There was a letter from Martha." I told him everything then, about her confession of giving my baby boy away for a private adoption. I could not bring myself to mention the sale, the $5,000. That detail felt like a separate poison, and I needed to keep it contained for now. I watched his face change, from simple confusion to dawning shock, then settling into a deep, sorrowful anger. "All these years," he whispered, his voice thick. "That woman sat at our table, ate our food." He squeezed my hand so tightly it almost hurt. "What do you want to do, Betty?" I told him I had already hired a man to look for our son. I said, "Our son," and Frank's eyes glistened in the twilight. He nodded slowly, without a second's hesitation. "Whatever it takes. We'll manage the cost. We'll find him." The relief that washed over me was so profound, it brought hot tears to my eyes. After carrying this alone, I finally had an ally. But the very next day, Martha tried a new tactic. She called mid-morning, her voice dripping with saccharine concern. "Betty, dear, I'm having a lovely financial planner over next week to look at some annuity options. This market is so confusing for us seniors. I thought you and Frank might want to sit in. He's a whiz at estate planning." I knew a trap when I heard one, dressed up in sisterly wool. This financial planner would likely poke around our affairs and suggest we were becoming incapable, needing a trusted family member to take over. Her. I thanked her for the thoughtful offer and said we'd have to check our calendar. Hanging up, the plastic receiver was slick in my palm. She was moving faster, tightening her net. My investigator needed time, and I wasn't sure we had any left to spare. Martin Lowe called back a week later, just as I was watering my geraniums. His news was a mixture of failure and a strange, thin hope. The case number led to a retired attorney named Arthur Bell, he explained. He handled all the legal filings for Graves Adoption Services. He's 94 now and lives in a memory care facility. I spoke to his daughter. He has his good moments, she said, but his official files from that practice were destroyed years ago. My heart sank right down to my slippers. Another solid wall. However, Martin continued, his voice lifting a little, his daughter mentioned he was a meticulous diarist. He kept daily appointment books, separate from his files. She still has them, stored in her garage. She's willing to let you look, if you come in person. She said her father might even respond to a familiar name from the past. A trip to the city, a meeting with a frail old man. It seemed a fragile chance, but it was all I had. I called my daughter to feed the cat and booked a train ticket for the next day. The memory care facility was bright and clean, with cheery paintings on the walls, but the air held a soft scent of antiseptic and somehow forgotten things. Arthur Bell's daughter, a kind but weary woman named Susan, met me in the lobby with a cardboard box. "He's having a good day," she said softly, "but don't be disappointed." In his small, sunlit room, Arthur sat in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket over his knees. He looked at me with milky, distant eyes. Susan leaned close to him. "Dad, this is Helen. She's asking about an old case of yours. From Graves Adoption. Case GA642. She repeated the number slowly. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then his gaze sharpened, just a little. "Graves," he muttered, his voice dry as leaves. "Eleanor Graves, sharp woman, cash cases." He turned his head slightly and looked more directly at me. "Jenkins?" he said, the name startlingly clear. My breath caught in my throat. "Yes," I managed to say. "The Jenkins infant." He nodded slowly, his head trembling with the effort. "Private placement. No agency oversight. I just filed the final order. Sealed it." He looked out the window again, his mind drifting somewhere I couldn't follow. Susan gently prompted him. "Do you remember where the baby was placed, Dad?" He was silent for so long, I thought the moment had passed. Then he spoke, not really to us, but to the air. "The couple from Hartford, the teacher, wanted a fresh start after their own loss. Good people," Eleanor said. He blinked slowly. Hartford. It was a city, a direction. It was more than I'd had in all my 60 years of wandering. I thanked him, my voice thick with emotion. Susan handed me the box of his old leather-bound appointment books. "Look for 1964, she whispered. Out in the quiet hallway, I sat on a padded bench and opened the book for that year. My fingers, spotted with age, traced the pages. And there it was, on the relevant date, in his tiny, neat script. Finalized Jenkins placement, Hartford, the Millers. I held the book close, the name Millers repeating in my mind like a long-awaited answer. The name Miller is as common as dirt, but paired with Hartford and teacher, it became a beacon for me. I carried that precious appointment book home like a treasure tucked into my suitcase. That evening, Frank held me close, and I felt a hope so sharp and terrifying I could barely give it a voice. I passed the details to Martin Lowe, our investigator. He sounded cautiously optimistic. "I'll start with Hartford's vital records," he explained in his calm way. "I'll cross-reference teachers named Miller from that period who had a son born in the right year." The wait that followed was excruciating. Every silent day felt like a week. Meanwhile, my sister Martha called twice more about her financial planner, her voice growing more strained and insistent. I kept deflecting, saying Frank was having a bad spell with his back, and we simply couldn't commit to a meeting. It was a lie, and I was sure she knew it. The tension finally broke on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Martha arrived at my door without any warning, something she never does. She stepped right into my foyer, not even bothering to wipe her shoes, her posture as rigid as a ruler. "We need to talk, Betty. I'm worried about you," she said, her eyes hard. "People are starting to talk. After the garden tour, Helen Briggs called me. She asked some very pointed questions about my finances well, after your tragic time. I know it was you who stirred that pot." I didn't deny it. I just looked at her, feeling the mask of the meek older sister I'd worn for decades finally fall away. "People should know the truth, Martha," I said, my voice quieter than I felt. She let out a laugh, a short, brittle sound with no warmth in it. "The truth? The truth is you were a broken mess, and I made a difficult decision for the good of that child. You should be thanking me." The sheer audacity of it stole the breath from my lungs. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a vicious whisper I felt in my bones. "Now, you will stop this nonsense. You will come to my financial meeting next week, and you will stop digging into ancient history, or I will have to have a very serious conversation with Frank and Emily about your declining mental state. You've been confused, Betty, agitated, talking about babies and conspiracies." She reached out then and patted my cheek. It was a gesture that was anything but affectionate. It was a cold, calculated threat. She was going to have me declared incompetent to silence me. She turned and left, leaving the scent of her expensive perfume and her palpable menace hanging in my quiet hallway. I stood there alone, my face burning where she had touched me. I had 1 week before she moved to lock me away by convincing everyone I was losing my mind. My only hope was that Martin Lowe could find something, anything, before Martha's deadline arrived. Martin Lowe's email arrived 3 days later. The subject line was simply, "Possible match." My hands shook so badly I could barely click the mouse. Frank hovered behind me, his hand on my shoulder. The email was careful, professional. He had located a couple in Hartford, James and Eleanor Miller. He was a high school history teacher. She was a librarian. They had adopted a baby boy in the summer of 1964 through a private arrangement. The child was named David. David Miller became a professor of literature at a small liberal arts college in Vermont. He was married, with 2 grown daughters. There was a photograph attached, taken from a university faculty page. A man in his early 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing before a bookshelf. I stared at that face, searching for my first husband's chin, my own father's brow. I couldn't see it, and yet I felt a pull so strong it was gravitational. "That's him," Frank said, his voice thick. "I feel it." Martin's email continued. He had not made contact. That decision was entirely mine. He included a phone number and an address. I printed the photo. I held the page in my hands, looking into the eyes of the son I never knew. The joy was immense, a soaring thing. But it was immediately chased by a cold, dark shadow. Martha. She thought she had buried this truth forever. She thought she held all the power, with her threats of incompetence and assisted living. She had no idea I was holding a photograph of the life she tried to erase. I had what I needed now. Not just for me, but for my revenge. Martha's entire life was built on the lie that she was the superior sister, the capable one, the one who made the hard choices. She valued her reputation, her standing, her sense of control above all else. I now possessed the ultimate tool to shatter that. But a raw, screaming confrontation would only give her a chance to spin more lies. I needed precision. I needed an audience. I thought of her upcoming financial planning meeting, the one she was forcing me to attend. She wanted to perform her concern for her unstable sister in front of a professional witness. I looked at the photo of David Miller, my son, and a calm, steelier resolve settled over me. I would go to her meeting, but I would not be playing the role she had written for me. I had a week to prepare what I would say, and this time the proof would not be hidden in a shed. It would be in my handbag, next to my heart medicine. The morning of Martha's financial planning meeting was cool and overcast. I dressed with extra care, choosing a simple, elegant navy dress. I wanted to look like a woman going to a serious appointment, not a nervous patient. My good handbag held a manila envelope. Inside was the printed photo of David Miller, a copy of that awful receipt from Graves Adoption Services, and a printout of Arthur Bell's diary entry. At our front door, Frank squeezed my hand. "Do you want me to come along?" he asked, his kind face lined with worry. I shook my head. "This is something I need to do with my sister," I told him. He understood and gave me a gentle nod. Martha's house was, as always, perfectly immaculate. She greeted me with a tight, perfunctory smile, her eyes quickly assessing my demeanor. "I'm so glad you've seen sense, Betty," she murmured as I stepped inside. In her formal living room, a young man in a crisp suit sat with a laptop open. He introduced himself as Mark from the firm. Martha took the seat of honor in her high-backed wingback chair, gesturing for me to sit on the softer, lower sofa. I recognized it as one of her little power plays. Mark began his presentation, full of charts about market volatility and the critical importance of secure, conservative management for those in our retirement years. Martha nodded along, looking every bit the wise and concerned sister. After about 10 minutes, Mark turned to me with a polite, practiced smile. "Mrs. Wilkins, your sister expressed a concern that you and your husband might be feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of your finances. We offer a full-service management option, where a trusted family member can be designated to make decisions in your best interest." He slid a glossy brochure across the coffee table toward me. Martha's expression was one of pure benevolent concern. I could see this was the moment she had been waiting for. I looked at the brochure but did not pick it up. Instead, I looked directly at Mark, keeping my voice calm and clear. "Before we discuss any of that, there's a matter of historical accounting that needs to be settled first. It pertains to a very substantial sum of money that was transferred from my family to my sister Martha back in 1964. Martha's smile froze solid on her face. Mark blinked, looking confused. I opened my envelope. I did not raise my voice. I laid the copy of the receipt on the table between us. "This is a receipt for $5,000 paid to Eleanor Graves by Monsieur Jenkins, that's my sister Martha, for arranging a private adoption. The adoption of my infant son, whom I was told was stillborn." The room went utterly silent. I placed the attorney's diary entry beside it. "And this is the legal record of the final placement." Finally, I placed the photo of David Miller facing Martha. "And this," I said, my voice steady, "is my son, the one you sold." Martha's face drained of all color, leaving a ghastly powdered mask. Her eyes darted from the papers to Mark's stunned face and back to me. For the first time in my life, I saw raw, unfiltered panic in my sister's eyes. It was a startling sight, this woman who had always been so in control. This is insane," she sputtered, her voice cracking. "Betty, what are you doing? These are forgeries. You're unwell." She turned desperately to Mark, her hands fluttering. "She's been under tremendous strain, confused since her husband passed. I told you we were all so concerned about her mental state." Mark looked deeply uncomfortable, a man who had expected a routine client meeting about wills or pensions, and now found himself in the middle of a familial earthquake. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the documents, then at me. I met his gaze steadily, the way I used to when my children tried to fib about their homework. "These documents are easily verified," I said quietly, my voice calmer than I felt. "The original receipt for the necklace is held by Eleanor Graves's daughter. The attorney's appointment diary is with his own daughter. My investigator has already traced my long-lost son. This is not confusion, Mr. Mark. This is 60-year-old fraud." I let the word hang in the air between us. It was a legal term, a cold, hard thing, but it tasted like stolen birthdays and a missing child. Martha stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly on the hardwood. "I want you to leave. Get out of my house right now." Her composure was shattered, her voice a shrill command. I remained seated, gathering my copies slowly and deliberately, taking my time. "Of course," I said. I looked at Mark. "I trust this clarifies why I will not be engaging your services, and why my sister is in no position to make decisions regarding my well-being. In fact, given this evidence of historical financial exploitation, I may need to consult my own attorney about her current fitness to manage her own affairs." The threat was clear, a perfect mirror of her own she had wielded against me. I walked to the door, my posture straight. I did not look back. I heard Martha beginning a frantic, rambling explanation to Mark, her words tumbling over each other, lies piling on lies like a shaky tower. Outside, the cool autumn air felt clean. I got into my car and sat for a long moment, my hands finally trembling on the steering wheel. The confrontation was over. I had not yelled. I had not cried. I had simply laid out the facts in front of a witness she herself had provided. Her perfect, controlled world was now fissured, and the crack would only widen. The gossip from the garden club tour was nothing compared to what a horrified financial planner might quietly share over coffee. I drove home, not with triumph, but with a deep, weary emptiness that settled in my bones. I had taken my revenge. Now I was just a tired grandmother with a name and a face, with a phone number for a son in my purse, and a decision about whether to call it that terrified me more than any argument ever could. A quiet week passed. Frank fielded 2 frantic, unanswered calls from Martha to the house phone. We did not speak of her. The noise of that battle had faded, leaving a strange silence in its wake. I kept the photo of David Miller on my nightstand. I looked at it every morning. He had a good face, a kind face. He had lived a whole life, a life of books and students and family, completely unaware of the woman whose heart had ached for him every single day. I thought about reaching out. I had the address. I drafted a dozen letters in my mind, but each one felt like an intrusion, a seismic event landing on the doorstep of a retired professor in Vermont. How do you tell a man in his 60s that his entire origin story is a lie? That his birth mother is a stranger, alive and longing for him? The thought of upsetting his life felt overwhelming. My revenge on Martha was complete. But this was about his peace, not mine. One afternoon, I sat at the small writing desk in my den, a sheet of nice stationery before me. I wrote not to David, but to his parents, James and Eleanor Miller, care of their last known address. I knew they were likely gone, but it felt right to address them first. I wrote a short, simple letter. I identified myself as Helen Jenkins, the birth mother of the son they adopted in 1964. I said I had only recently discovered the truth of his adoption, and that I held no anger, only a hope that they had given him a wonderful life. I enclosed a copy of the photo of him, and on the back I wrote only, "He looks happy. Thank you." I included my name and address, and a sentence saying that if David ever wished to know anything about his medical history or about me, I would be here. I made no demands. I asked for nothing. I sealed the envelope and put a stamp on it. I held it for a long moment. This wasn't an end, just letting go. I had pulled the thread and unraveled the lie. I had protected my home and my husband. I had shown my sister the reflection of her own cruelty. Now, I was placing the truth, gently, into the universe. Whether it ever reached him was not for me to control. I walked to the mailbox at the end of our driveway and slipped the letter inside. As I walked back, Frank was coming out to meet me, his hand extended. The late afternoon sun was warm on my shoulders. The ache for the baby was still there, a quiet, familiar companion. But the corrosive poison of not knowing was gone. I took my husband's hand. We turned and walked slowly back toward our house, toward the quiet, ordinary life we had built together. It was enough.